Hey guys, this is BunnyMuffins. Today I am going to show you guys an early game guide. We are going to be breaking down this video into two different parts. So the first part is going to be all the theoretical stuff you need to do in the early game before going into the game. And then the second part will be breaking down step by step how to play every single stage from the beginning of stage 1 all the way to the end of stage 2. Early games are probably one of the most important parts of TFT because it sets the stage for the rest of the game. And a lot of times the middle and late parts of the game are pretty much on autoplay because you already set everything up for that game in the early game. Do keep in mind that this guide will be able to cover every single types of composition because again, this is an early game guide and you could pretty much use this to transition into any comp you want later into the game. So before we get into the early game itself, and even before pressing play on your client, it's always a good idea to know what units and compositions are good in the meta. And a lot of you guys already know what units and comps are good by going to the meta snapshot at bunnymuffins.lol, but in reality, that's not actually enough. You also have to have a good understanding of what good early game units are and how to set them up. Knowing what units to go for also helps you know what units to avoid as well, because oftentimes that could cost you a lot of gold in the early game by holding on to weak, expensive units. So I'm going to break this first video down into 3 sections. The first one is being the strong early game item holders, and then we'll talk about strong early game synergies, and then we'll end off with pretty much every single bit of item info you need for the early game. So first, onto item holders. These are generally going to be your units that can hold either your damage or tank items. We're going to be focusing on damage first, and you will notice that a large amount of these units are 3 cost units compared to 1 and 2 costs. So from all the early game units 1, 2, and 3 costs, here is a sample ranking of how strong each of them are. So obviously in the early game, the strongest ones are going to be 2-star 3 costs, followed by 2-star 2 costs, and then after that, a 1-star 3 cost is going to be better than a 2-star 1 cost, and then a 1-star 2 cost is going to be better than a 1-star 1 cost. So while this doesn't mean you can't use 1 cost as item holders, it's usually a lot harder to because you will want to 2-star them, and even at 2-star, they'll only be roughly equivalent in power to a 1-star 3 cost unit. This makes pivoting with 1 cost units, while not necessarily worse, it is much more difficult to do than with a 2 or 3 cost unit holder. So now we are going to list out every strong item holder for each cost, and do keep in mind that the damage item holders are using more specific items, while tank item holders are able to use more items because tanks can kind of hold anything. The most important thing to keep in mind is always try to itemize your units who are upgraded because star levels are generally more important than using a specific unit. So onto the 1 cost, we have Kled, Ziggs, Callista, and Kha'Zix as some of the better item holders, and then in 2 costs we have Brand, Syndra, Varus, and Victor. Onto the 3 costs, we have Katarina, Lee Sin, Yasuo, Riven, Lux, Ashe, Zyra, and Nidalee. And again, a lot more of these guys are 3 cost units because again, 3 cost units are going to be the better item holders in the early game. Do keep in mind there are many different ways to play the early game. This is just what I found to be the easiest. So now that we have the item holders identified, we need to look at some early game traits. So traits always have to complement whoever your item holder is and whoever you have upgraded because that is going to give you the most power to your team. Next, we will also need to note that some traits are easier to transition into stronger comps than others, especially if the vertical synergy is particularly strong on that patch. In case you guys didn't know what a vertical synergy is, this is a term that's being used a lot more in TFT, and it's pretty much just a fancy way of saying a big synergy. For example, 6 Redeemed, 6 Forgotten, and 6 Dawnbringer, those are going to be considered vertical synergies. But before we get into that, let's get into the strong early game synergies. So in most cases, these synergies are able to be played for the rest of the game. So first, let's think about what makes a strong early game synergy. They either have to help you tremendously win streak in the early game, or they are playable throughout the entirety of the game so that you could keep them in your comp and transition into stronger versions of that synergy pretty seamlessly throughout the mid game and the late game. Do keep in mind that synergies do go in and out of the meta, but since we are at the end of the set, I felt like it's a good time to release this guide because most of the meta is going to be pretty stabilized for the rest of the set. So some of my favorite synergies in the early game are Redeemed, Draconic, and Abominations, Forgotten, and Dawnbringer. So starting off with Redeemed, this is probably one of the stronger synergies in the early game due to having a large variety of item holders, and it also transitions very easily into the mid and late game. For example, you could go into a 6 Redeemed build with Lux or Vel'Koz carry, you could go into a Varus Pantheon carry, you could go into Heimer, Ivern, and Volibear builds, and you could also go into some sort of Kayle build potentially as well. Next up, we have Draconics plus Abominations or Skirmishers. And this build is really good because you get a ton of extra economy from Draconics, and then you just sell them for whatever comp you're playing later in the game. Or you can get certain Draconic units to 3-star and use them as carries. And units within these synergies also are great item holders for pretty much any type of build. So some of your late game carry options from a Draconic and Abomination build is the Zyra 3 carry with Abominations, another one is Ashe 3 with 4 Rangers, and then the last one could be like a Skirmisher reroll if you happen to be running Skirmishers with Draconics. On to the next synergy, we have Forgotten. Forgotten has gotten nerfed recently because it is more reliant on getting shadow items, but it transitions very easily into the 6 Forgotten composition, which again, vertical synergies are pretty strong right now, and you also have all types of item holders from attack speed on Vayne to ability power items on Katarina, so you could go into pretty much any direction using this build. The last synergy we're going to be talking about is Dawnbringer, and Dawnbringers are a pretty straightforward vertical synergy. You just want to play around Karma and then transition into Heimerdinger, so those are going to be your 2 primary options for the late game. The great thing about Dawnbringer is that the thresholds are pretty easy to hit. They are 2, 4, and 6 Dawnbringer, whereas the Redeemed and Forgotten traits you need 3 or 6, so you do experience a little bit of a power troph before you get to 6 Redeemed, for example. However, Dawnbringer doesn't run into that problem because they could get a synergy boost at either 2 or 4 Dawnbringer. Now let's get into everything you need to know about itemization in the early game. So starting off in the opening carousel, we are going to be talking about starting items. So at the start of the game, you go into a carousel and you have to choose one component on the carousel, which pretty much defines a lot of the direction you are going to go in this particular game. So what I like to do is have a carousel priority, listing out every single item I want from best to worst. Oftentimes you will need to match this with what compositions you are most familiar with, or you could follow the one on my website at bunnymuffins.lol. The one listed on my website is more flexible, so if you are only really like a master of 1 or 2 compositions, whenever I release a guide, I do make specific carousel priorities for those particular compositions. For example, if sword is the best one in the meta right now, but you are going for a Karma build, of course you're going to go for either a rod or tier at the start, and I do list out those priorities in my Karma guide, for example. As you become more familiar with TFT, you could experiment with different types of starts and more types of compositions so that you'll be able to really find what works best for you, given what you know. Because again, in TFT, everyone plays a little bit differently and everyone has their own style. So even though something might be the best thing to go for, you need to do what's best for you in that particular games. Before we get into the components, I want to talk a little bit more about how you get items in TFT. So the first one you guys probably already know, items you take from the carousel or armory are independent of one another. What this means is that getting a sword on the carousel doesn't affect any of your item drops later into the game or what appears in your armory. However, items dropped from the neutral rounds or the PvE rounds are dependent on one another. Essentially, you have a pool of items that you can take from, and this mechanic essentially prevents you from getting too much of one particular item. As an example, by Raptors, you can get a maximum of 3 natural item drops of a specific item, so you can't get more than like 3 Negatrons, let's say, by Raptors from the PvE rounds. Of course, if you take them from the armory or the carousel, you could end up getting more than 3 of one particular item. So to explain this mechanic, the items you get from creeps are taken without replacement from an item bag. So at the start of the game, you start with 1 of each component in your item bag during stage 1, and when you drop a component of one of those items, it's removed from the bag. This means by the time you reach stage 2-1, you can only get duplicate components of the item you took off of carousel. If you start the game with a sword and another sword drops during stage 1, you will never be in a scenario where you get another sword drop and you start the game with 3 swords. During every subsequent creep round, you get 1 additional item component added to the bag. For every subsequent creep round, 1 of each component is added to the bag twice, giving us a maximum of 3 copies of each item. I know that was very confusing, but essentially what this means is if you get an item from the creep rounds, you are less likely to see it in the future. What you can do with this information is if you are on the stage 4 carousel and you're looking to finish a particular item, you can kind of guess what you won't get or will get from your Raptor round based on what dropped earlier in the game. You should also be wary about taking items from a carousel that have not dropped for you from your neutral rounds, because again, you are more likely to get those components later in the game. So an example of this is if you are playing an ability power composition where you need a lot of rods, an item you generally do not want is a bow. So let's say you have a chain vest and you want to make a Titan's Resolve on one of your tanks when playing an AP comp. You generally do not want to take a bow off a carousel because you are pretty likely to get a drop from that on the PvE rounds if you just wait a little bit. It's really risky to take a bow off that carousel, even if it is one of the best items for one of your particular tanks, let's say, because again, if you get too many bows in an AP comp, they kind of become wasted later on. So now that we have that covered, let's talk about the starting item components and what directions they generally go into. So the two most flexible item starts, in my opinion, are going to be either belt or chain vest, and this is because these items are just generic tank items, and tank items are needed in every single composition. If you're leaning towards an attack damage comp such as Draven, Aphelios, or Riven, you could go for an item such as bow or sword, since these are generally going to be the best for attack damage compositions. Conversely, if you're going for an ability power composition, go for a rod or tear for obvious reasons. Two items that are generally weaker in the early game are going to be either a Negatron cloak or a glove, and the reason behind this is that cloak is generally considered the worst item in the game, and glove, while great in the late game, is generally weak early because most of the items built from a glove are items that scale, and they don't really help you that much in the early game. Doesn't mean it's bad, just means that it isn't good for win streaking. Now that we have that out of the way, let's get into specific items you should be building with each item component. So let's first start off with the rod. So rod is generally built for AP compositions, but let's say you start with a rod, but you get a great start for an attack damage composition. Here are some things you could build which are pretty flexible in the early game, and that would be Locket, which is built with a chain, Rageblade, which is built with a bow, and then Morello, which is built with a belt. So these three items are pretty flexible and they could fit into a lot of different compositions, or they help you win streak a lot, in which case the gain gold and health that you get from the win streak would outweigh the cost of having a suboptimal item later in the game. Some situational items you could build with rod, such as if you are going for an ability power composition, are Jeweled Gauntlet, Ionic Spark, and Death Cap. Moving on to tier, the flexible item for tier is going to be Redemption, and then the situational slammable early items are going to be Blue Buff or Shojin. Next, let's talk about the sword. Flexible items for sword is going to be Guardian Angel, and then situational early game items you could build with sword are either Deathblade or Shojin. After that, we have the bow. Flexible items for the bow are going to be Zizirot Portal, and then situational items are going to be Tear, Rageblade, and Runon's Hurricane. Lastly, you could build a Last Whisper, potentially with a bow, and this is just dependent on the meta if Last Whisper is good or not. Next, we have the belt. Belt is great because you can build all sorts of flexible early game items, which doesn't really lock you into a specific composition. These items are going to be Warmogs, Redemption, Morellonomicon, Sunfire, and Zizirot Portal. After that, we have Chain, the other flexible item that I like, and you can build Sunfire, Guardian Angel, Locket, or Stoneplate with this. Next, we have the glove. Really, there are only two items you could build with glove early game, and that is going to be Jeweled Gauntlet and Last Whisper. Again, Jeweled Gauntlet only works with ability power comps, and Last Whisper only works with attack damage compositions if armor is strong in that particular meta. Lastly, we have Cloak. You never really want a cloak, but sometimes you just get one in your games, and a flexible early item you could build is a Stoneplate, and then situational items you could build are Runon's Hurricane and Ionic Spark. Next, let's talk about shadow items, because again, shadow items are a critical part of this particular set. And starting with Shadow Rod, items you could build that are flexible are Shadow Locket and Shadow Morello, and then early game items are Shadow JG, Shadow Ionic Spark, and Shadow Death Cap. With the Shadow tier, similar items from before, but you could build Shadow Redemption, but you could also try using Shadow Hand of Justice because healing works in a lot of different compositions. And lastly, Shadow Blue Buff is an option if you're going for a unit that needs that specific mana threshold. With Shadow Sword, your options are a little limited. I generally only go for Shadow Guardian Angel as a flexible item, and then Shadow Deathblade as an attack damage item, and then Shadow Bow is decent with Shadow Runon's Hurricane and Shadow Last Whisper. Shadow Belt is probably one of my favorite items to have in the early game because I feel like Shadow Warmogs is really good, followed by Shadow Redemption, Shadow Morello, and then Shadow Sunfire. With the Shadow Chain, again, most of the items are pretty flexible, and I would go for a Shadow Sunfire, Shadow Guardian Angel, Shadow Locket, and Shadow Stoneplate. With the Shadow Glove, I would go for a Shadow Hand of Justice as a flexible item, and then Shadow Jeweled Gauntlet if I'm going for AP, and then Shadow Last Whisper if I'm going for a build that requires both magic and armor penetration. Last shadow item we are going to go over is Shadow Cloak, and this one, the flexible item is Shadow Stoneplate, and then we have the situational items of Shadow Runon's Hurricane and Shadow Ionic Spark, depending if you're going for AD or AP. So every item that we've mentioned so far are all strong in the early game and pretty makeable in most situations. The situational items that we talked about before will commit you to a certain composition tree, whether it be AP or AD. So even though they are very strong items, you should only make them if you have both the item holder for that item and the intention to go for one of those compositions. In the next video, we are going to go step by step how to play every single stage during stage 1 and stage 2. But I hope you guys found this helpful in terms of getting ready before going into a game of TFT for the early game. Again, the early game is probably one of the most important parts of TFT because it sets everything up later, and I hope you guys were able to learn who the strong early game item holders are, what types of synergies to generally go for, and also get an overview of every playable item in the early game. So if you guys did enjoy that and you want to get notified for part 2, definitely subscribe below if you haven't already and turn notifications on. And if you guys learned something new in this video, go ahead, hit the like, and share it with a friend if you guys already did all that and want to do even more. I'll be posting the written guide of this on my website at bunnymuffins.lol. I'll leave a link in the description below because, again, a lot of these topics were a little confusing, so maybe sometimes reading it is going to be a lot easier than hearing it. So definitely go check that out if you want to get more details on the early game. But that is it from me today. Hope you guys enjoyed that, and I will see you all next time. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to share and subscribe, and of course smash that like button. Each like is an LP I gain before the next video.